I have been called many things in my life: feared, cold, exacting, unreasonable. My steward calls me precise. My solicitor calls me thorough. My mother, God rest her, called me impossible from the time I was 11 years old and corrected her French at the dinner table. None of these things prepared me for Myra Calloway. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened. When I rode into the village of Calworth on the 14th of May, 1847, I was not looking for anything except a reliable survey of the property I had just acquired. The Aldenmere estate had sat in chancery for 3 years following the death of its former owner, and the acquisition had been, from my perspective, entirely administrative. Land, stone, acreage. A mill, 2 tenant farms, 1 church, 1 public house, and 1 village school, the last of which my solicitor had helpfully noted was operating in what was, structurally speaking, the most useful building on the secondary lot. I had no particular interest in children's education. I had every interest in a well-placed storage annex for the estate's agricultural surplus. These 2 facts, I felt, were not incompatible. The school would relocate. Villages had churches. Churches had vestry rooms. The matter seemed, to me, straightforward. It took Myra Calloway approximately 6 minutes to explain to me, in front of 17 villagers, 2 aldermen, and a very embarrassed vicar, precisely why I was wrong. I remember the moment she stood up. The village council had convened in the public house, a low-ceilinged room smelling of tallow and old wood, the kind of place I would not ordinarily have entered at all. My steward, Holt, had advised me to send a letter. I had declined. It had seemed at the time more efficient to attend in person, to state the plan directly, to answer questions, and to leave. 30 minutes, perhaps 40. She was sitting at the far end of the long table. I had not noticed her when I came in. She was not the sort of woman one noticed immediately, not because there was anything lacking in her face, which was quite striking once you actually looked at it, but because she was entirely still. She had the quality of someone who was listening so carefully that they had decided, for the moment, not to take up any unnecessary space. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her. She had a small leather notebook open beside them, and she had been writing in it steadily since I began speaking. I had just finished explaining the plan for the schoolroom. I had been, I thought, perfectly clear, reasonable, even generous. I had offered the church a small sum for the use of the vestry room during the transition. The vicar was nodding. The aldermen were nodding. Holt, at my shoulder, looked relieved. Then she stood up. She was not tall. She was perhaps 5 feet and 3 inches, in a plain gray dress that had been mended at the left cuff, with dark hair pinned back severely and eyes that were, I noticed this, I couldn't help it, a very particular shade of gray-green, like the sky over the channel before a storm. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has been waiting politely for a long time and has now decided that patience has served its purpose. "Your Grace," she said, "I wonder if you visited the vestry room." Her voice was clear and even, not deferential, not rude, simply direct in the way of someone who had spent years projecting to the back of a room. "I have not," I said, "but my surveyor has noted its dimensions." "Your surveyor noted 19 feet by 11, she said. "I have 43 children. The youngest is 4. The eldest is 14 and preparing for a placement examination in September." She paused. She looked at her notebook, then back at me. "The vestry room has 1 window, no fireplace, and a floor that floods 6 inches deep in January. I know this because I taught there for 1 winter before the current schoolroom was built, 12 years ago, by subscription of the village. Your Grace's predecessor contributed the stone." There was a silence. I was aware, uncomfortably aware, of 17 pairs of eyes moving between us. "There are other options," I said. "A temporary structure." "A temporary structure," she said, "will not survive a Wiltshire winter, as I suspect your surveyor, if he is local, could have told you." It will also not have the light that 43 children require for 8 hours of daily instruction, or the dimensions to fit 2 rows of benches and a teaching board, or the proximity to the well that allows us to manage the children's health through summer. She turned one page of her notebook, unhurried. I have the subscription records from the original building, if your grace would like to see the cost of construction. I also have the examination results from the past 4 years, which I would suggest indicate that the building is being put to rather better use than grain storage. Someone at the far end of the table made a sound that might, charitably, have been a cough. I looked at Myra Calloway. She looked back at me. She was not defiant. She was not angry. She was simply the most composed person in the room, and she had just, point by point, dismantled every element of a plan I had arrived believing to be settled. "I will," I said after a moment, "review the survey." "I thought you might," she said, and sat back down and picked up her pen. I did not repurpose the schoolroom. I told Holt it was because the structural survey had raised questions about load-bearing capacity, which was true, as it happened. The secondary lot's flooring was not designed for heavy storage. This was an entirely satisfactory explanation. Holt wrote it down and asked no further questions. I rode back to the Aldenmere house, a fine Georgian property that had been somewhat neglected in the Chancery years, but was fundamentally sound. And I sat in what would become my study, and I thought, with rather more attention than the matter probably warranted, about a woman in a gray dress with a leather notebook and the examination results of 43 children. I had been argued with before. I was not accustomed to being wrong, but I had been argued with. What was unusual, what I found privately to be the most interesting aspect of the evening, was that she had not been angry. She had not been nervous. She had not been trying to impress me or to humiliate me. She had simply been correct, and she had said so, and she had sat back down. I had, in my experience, never met anyone who disagreed with me quite so tidily. I came back to Colworth 3 days later. I told Holt it was to inspect the mill. I inspected the mill. Then I walked past the schoolroom. The windows were open. It was a warm morning for May, and through the open windows I could hear her voice, not the careful, even public voice from the council meeting, but something quicker, more alive, asking questions, listening to the answers, laughing at something a child had said. I stopped on the lane and stood there for longer than was dignified, listening to the sound of a lesson about the rivers of England, delivered with the enthusiasm of someone who found rivers genuinely interesting. I did not go in. I walked onto the estate and spent 2 hours with the mill accounts, which were straightforward and unremarkable. Then I rode home. I came back a week after that, and the week after that. The third time I had a reason. The estate records there was a question about the boundary survey on the eastern field, and the village held the older maps, which were apparently kept in the church. The vicar, a gentle man named Aldwick who seemed permanently startled by my presence, directed me to the schoolroom. "Miss Calloway maintains the records," he said, with an apologetic air, as though this might be inconvenient for me. "She organized them some years ago. She'll know exactly where the boundary maps are." I thanked him. I walked across the lane. I knocked on the schoolroom door. It was a Saturday. The children were not there. She was at the large table at the front of the room, surrounded by paper stacked in careful piles, annotated, some of it pinned to a board behind her. She was wearing the same gray dress, or one very like it. She looked up when I knocked, and her expression, I noticed this, was entirely unsurprised. "Your Grace," she said. She did not stand. "The boundary maps are the third pile from the left, the ones with the red ribbon." I found the pile. I sat down. There was a chair on the other side of the table, and I opened the top map, and she went back to her work, and for a while there was no sound in the room except the scratch of her pen and the occasional rustle of old paper. It was, I realized slowly, one of the most comfortable silences I had sat in for years. "You arranged all of this yourself?" I said after a time. She looked up. Over several winters, yes. The records were in some disorder when I arrived. The previous schoolmaster had not been particularly systematic. She paused. I find it useful to know the history of a place. And the history of this place. She considered this. Calworth has been a working agricultural village for 400 years, she said. It has survived plague, famine, the Civil War, enclosure, and 3 different families of landlords with 3 different ideas about what a village is for. It tends to outlast the plans that are made for it. There was a particular quality to the way she said this last sentence that made me look up from the map. She was looking at me with those gray-green eyes, and there was something in them, not quite a smile, not quite a challenge, something more patient than either. I see, I said. I thought you might, she said, and picked up her pen again. I began to find reasons to be in Calworth with what Holt, to his credit, never directly commented upon. The mill accounts, the tenant farm surveys, a question about drainage on the lower field, a question about the church roof, which was not strictly my concern but which I had begun to feel some proprietary interest in. Holt scheduled these visits with admirable neutrality and asked me nothing. On 4 of the 6 visits over the following 3 weeks, I found myself in the schoolroom. This was not entirely by design, I told myself. The records were there. The maps were there. Myra Calloway was there on Saturday mornings, doing whatever it was she did with her Saturdays, which appeared to involve a great deal of quiet administrative work of the kind that most people would have found someone else to do. We argued. This was, in a sense, the substance of our acquaintance. We argued about the drainage plan. She felt the lower field's water table had been misread, and she was right. We argued about the proposed repair to the Tennant Road. She felt the surface material the surveyor had recommended was unsuitable for the winter traffic, and she had figures from the past 15 years of maintenance records to support this. We argued about history. I had made an offhand remark about the agricultural reforms of the previous decade, and she had corrected me with sources, and the correction had led to a conversation that lasted 2 hours and ranged from the corn laws to the specific challenges faced by village schools under the new inspection regime, a subject about which she had opinions that were clear, detailed, and impossible to dismiss. She never raised her voice. She never softened her positions to make me comfortable. She never said, as most people did, of course, Your Grace, or as Your Grace sees fit. She said, I think you're mistaken, and here is why. She said, that's an interesting position, but it doesn't account for, and then she would account for whatever it was, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had thought it through long before I arrived. I began to lose arguments on purpose, just to see what she would say next. I noticed, too, the shape of the life around her. The way the children greeted her on the lane, not the wary, deferential greeting that most children gave to authority, but something warmer, more easy. The way old Mrs. Aldwick brought her a jar of preserves on a Tuesday and stayed to talk for half an hour on the school steps. The way the 2 tenant wives stopped her after the Sunday service and asked about something, and she listened with the full attention she gave to everything, and answered, and they left looking as though they had been given something they had needed. She was the kind of person a village runs on, quietly, without knowing it. I thought about this more than I had thought about any acquisition in years. It was on the 5th Saturday, the 2nd week of June, the day genuinely warm now, the schoolroom windows wide open to a sky of uncomplicated blue, that she said something that stopped me entirely. I had been making a case for consolidating the 2 tenant farms under a single management agreement. I had figures. I had a model from 3 other estates in the county. I had a reasonable argument. She listened to all of it, then she set her pen down. Your Grace, she said, can I ask you something that is not about the farms? I looked up from my notes. Yes. Why do you keep coming back? The room was very quiet. Through the window, somewhere in the village, a blackbird was singing with absolute conviction. I realized, several answers to this question, the honest one and the other ones. I had spent 6 weeks choosing the other ones, and they had served me adequately. The records, I said, the boundary question on the eastern is resolved, she said. It was resolved 3 weeks ago. You noted it yourself. The drainage. The drainage report was submitted to your surveyor on the 9th. Holt confirmed it. I looked at her. She looked back at me with that expression, patient, unimpressed, entirely without cruelty. The expression of someone who is simply waiting for the truth. The arguments, I said after a long moment. She was very still. I beg your pardon. You are, I said carefully, the only person who has argued with me consistently, correctly, for the past 6 weeks, without wanting anything from me in return. This is, I find it, I had not realized how much I had missed it. She looked at me for a long moment. Then very quietly she said, missed arguing. Missed someone who didn't treat every word I said as though it had arrived from God, I said. My tenants defer to me. My solicitor defers to me. My steward defers to me. Everyone I employ or am related to defers to me. It is, I stopped. I was not ordinarily a man who spoke this plainly. It is, I said, very lonely. The blackbird sang. The June light came through the windows and lay in warm strips across the old wooden floor. Myra Calloway looked at me as though she were seeing something she had suspected, but not quite confirmed. That, she said slowly, is the most honest thing you have said since you arrived in this village. Yes, I said, I know. She did not make it easy. I want to be clear about that because in the telling of things like this, the woman often softens at the moment of confession and the rest flows simply. Myra did not soften. She considered. She told me on the following Wednesday, I had found an excuse to come back on a Wednesday, which was new, that she did not know what to make of me. She said this directly, without apology, as she said everything. She said that she had taught 43 children to think carefully before they spoke, and she tried to hold herself to the same standard, and she was not yet sure what thinking carefully about Jasper Vane, Duke of Aldenmere, would produce. I told her I was willing to wait. She said she would hold me to that. Over the following weeks, something shifted, slowly and without fanfare. The arguments continued. She was constitutionally incapable of leaving a poorly reasoned position unchallenged, and I had begun to find this not irritating but genuinely sustaining, in the way a strong wind is sustaining after a long time in still air. But alongside the arguments, other things happened. She showed me the examination records, not to make a point, but because she wanted to. She had been teaching in Calworth for 8 years, and the placement results had improved steadily each year, and she was proud of this in a clean, uncomplicated way that I found entirely admirable. I told her so. She accepted the compliment without deflecting it or performing modesty, which was exactly what I would have expected. I showed her the estate records, the real ones, the century of accounts and surveys and decisions that told the story of Aldenmere as a place rather than a property. She was, I discovered, genuinely interested. She asked questions I had not thought to ask. She noticed things in the old ledgers, patterns in the tenant rents, correlations between the harvest records and the years of low school attendance, a running note in a previous steward's hand about a spring on the lower field that had been covered over some time in the 1790s, and that might, if reopened, solve the drainage question more permanently than any surface treatment. You should have been an archivist, I told her. I am an archivist, she said, also a schoolmistress. Also the person who writes the letters that get things done in this village, because someone has to. I contain multitudes, Your Grace. It was the first time she had said anything close to a joke, and I laughed, genuinely, with surprise, and she looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before, something warm and a little startled, as though the laugh had been unexpected for her too. We were in the estate library by then. I had invited her to consult the older land records, the ones that predated the village holdings, and she had come with her notebook, and we had spent 4 hours going through volumes that had not been opened in 40 years, and the afternoon had gone in the way that good afternoons go, without one noticing. The light in the library was fading when she looked up from a ledger and said, "Your Grace, it is past 6 o'clock." I looked at the windows. The sky was the soft amber of a summer evening. I had entirely lost track of the time. "So it is," I said. She closed the ledger carefully and began to gather her notes. I watched her do this, the same neat efficiency she brought to everything, and I felt something settle in my chest that I did not have a ready name for. Something like, I would like her to come back tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. "Myra," I said. She looked up. It was the first time I had used her given name. I saw her register it, a brief stillness, no more, then the gray-green eyes steady on mine. "Your Grace," she said. "Jasper," I said, "since we are apparently on terms of sufficient honesty." She considered this for a moment. "Jasper," she said, trying it, and the sound of it in her voice was, I am not a man who uses the word undone lightly, but I was, at that moment, somewhat undone. "Come back tomorrow," I said. "There are 4 more volumes from the 1780s that we haven't looked at, and I would like the company." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she picked up her notebook and her pen and tucked them under her arm. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said, "on the condition that you stop sending Holt to explain your visits and simply come yourself." "Done," I said. "And on the condition," she said, moving toward the door, "that you accept when you are wrong that you are wrong without the 10 minutes of thinking about whether to accept it." "That," I said, "may take practice." "Fortunately," she said, pausing in the doorway, the amber light behind her, "I have considerable experience teaching people things that take practice." And she left, and I stood in my library in the fading summer light and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. July came in warm and unhurried, the Wiltshire countryside at its most unapologetic, the lanes thick with hedgerow and the estate gardens somewhat overgrown from the Chancery years, but coming back slowly, with the attention I had begun to give them. I came to Calworth on my own. No Holt, no surveyor, no administrative purpose. I came on Tuesday mornings when the school was in session and sat on the low stone wall across the lane and listened to the lessons through the open windows, which was, I was aware, an unusual occupation for a duke, but which I found inexplicably sustaining. I came on Saturday afternoons and worked in the library while she worked in the schoolroom, and at some point in the early afternoon, one of us would walk across the lane and join the other, and we would argue about something, or not, and the afternoon would go. She was, I was discovering, a woman of enormous reserves, of patience, of knowledge, of the kind of quiet strength that doesn't announce itself. She had come to Calworth at 22, she told me, after a year in a city school that had been very large and very indifferent and not particularly interested in whether the children actually learned anything. She had wanted, she said, to teach somewhere that mattered. She had answered an advertisement. She had arrived on a Tuesday in October with 2 trunks and a box of books, and she had stayed. "Did you not find it lonely?" I asked. We were in the garden. I had been making some attempt to restore the rose beds, which had gone entirely to wilderness, and she had arrived one afternoon with her own pair of gloves and an opinion about how to approach the thorniest section, and had simply joined in. A woman of your particular quality, in a small village. She considered this. She was cutting back a particularly aggressive climber with the focused attention she brought to everything. "I found it exactly as lonely as anywhere else," she said. "I am better suited to a few people I know well than to many people I know poorly. Calworth suits me," she paused, "or it has. I am perhaps revising that assessment." "In what direction?" I said. She looked at me sideways from under the brim of her hat, a plain straw hat, slightly battered, entirely characteristic. "A more interesting direction," she said, and went back to the climber. I did not press her. I was learning, slowly, that Myra Calloway said what she meant when she was ready to say it, and that patience was not merely a strategy but a demonstration of respect, and that she noticed whether you were demonstrating it. I pressed her once, toward the end of July, and it did not go well. We had been talking about the placement examination, her eldest students, the ones she was preparing for September, and what would happen to them if they placed well. She was matter-of-fact about it. They would go, and that was the point, and she was glad of it, and she would miss them, and she would not say so to them because they needed to go without guilt. I had said something. I cannot now reconstruct exactly what, something about how she must feel being left behind, and whether she had ever thought of leaving herself. She set her pen down. She looked at me in a way that was not angry but was very precise. "Your Grace," she said, and she had gone back to the formal address which I had learned was a sign. "I am not someone waiting to be rescued from my life. I chose this life. I chose this village and this work and the people in it. I am not a woman who was overlooked and is waiting for someone to notice her. I am a woman who built exactly what she intended to build, and I am rather proud of it." The silence afterward was considerable. "I know," I said, "I know that. I said it badly." "You said it as though my life were insufficient," she said, "and required supplementing." "I did," I said. "I'm sorry, that isn't what I think." She looked at me for a long moment, then she picked her pen back up. "What do you think?" she said, quietly, not as a challenge, as a genuine question. "I think," I said slowly, "that you built something extraordinary, and that I have been trying, for several months, to find a way to be part of it that doesn't require you to be less than what you are." The pen was still. The room was very quiet. "That," she said after a moment, "is somewhat better." The evening I remember most clearly was a Tuesday in early August. I had come to the village without a plan, which was new for me and which I had been practicing, in the way she had suggested I practice things that did not come naturally. The school was finished for the day. The lane was quiet. I found her in the garden behind the schoolroom, a narrow strip of ground she had planted herself, with the children in the spring, the vegetables now coming in strongly, the sunflowers at the back reaching above the stone wall. She was sitting on the low bench at the far end, reading. She looked up when she heard the gate. "I didn't know you were coming today," she said. "I didn't either," I said. "I just came." She moved along the bench, without comment, to make room. I sat down. The evening was warm, the light thick and golden, the kind of August evening that seems to be making an argument for staying exactly where you are. The sunflowers were very tall. The garden smelled of warm earth and something green and sweet that I could not name. "Myra," I said. "Yes," she said, not a question. "I am going to say something," I said, "and I would like to say all of it before you assess it, because I have been thinking about it for some time and I want to get it right." She folded her book and set it on her knee. "All right," she said. "I came to this village to acquire a property," I said. "I came to rationalize and survey and improve, and to treat the whole business as a set of problems to be solved efficiently. I have, in my adult life, treated most things as problems to be solved efficiently, including people, including, I think, myself." I looked at the sunflowers. "You argued with me at the council meeting and you were right about everything, and then you sat back down and I could not stop thinking about it. I have been coming back every week for 3 months, and the reason is not the maps or the drainage or the boundary survey. The reason is that when I am with you, I think more clearly and feel more honestly than I do at any other time, and I find that I am unwilling to be without it. Without you. I am unwilling to be without you." I stopped. The garden was very quiet. "I am not asking you to be anything other than what you are," I said. I'm not asking you to leave Calworth or to stop being the person who runs this village from a schoolroom with a leather notebook. I am asking whether there is a version of the next part of your life that includes me in it. Honestly includes me. Not because I am a duke, but because, I paused. Because I believe you find me, at least occasionally, somewhat interesting. The silence lasted long enough that I became aware of the blackbird again, the same one, or one very like it, somewhere in the elm trees. Somewhat, she said. I looked at her. The corner of her mouth was very slightly curved. Somewhat interesting, I said. Considerably, if I am being accurate, she said, which I generally try to be. She looked at me directly, as she always did. You are quite different from what you appeared at the council meeting. I am aware that at the council meeting, I appeared to be a man who wanted to put 43 children in a vestry room with a flooding floor. Yes, she said, that was not your finest moment. In my defense, I said, the structural survey was genuinely incomplete. In your defense, she said, almost smiling now, you listened. That is not nothing. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at me. I will not come to London. I will not give up the school. I will not become someone who attends balls and nods politely at people she doesn't respect. I would not ask you to, I said. I find balls largely intolerable, and I have never been able to nod politely at people I don't respect either. We could be intolerable together. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, the laugh I had first heard through the school windows in May, and I felt it in my chest like a key turning. That, she said, is the second most honest thing you've said to me. What was the most honest? I said. That you had missed someone who didn't treat your words as though they'd arrived from God. She looked at me steadily. I think you should be told that more often. I think, I said, I would like you to be the one telling me. The August light was very warm. The sunflowers stood up straight and confident against the stone wall. Yes, she said quietly, completely. We married in October in the Calworth church, with 43 children in attendance and old Mrs. Aldwick in the front row with a clean handkerchief and an expression of great satisfaction, and the vicar so moved he lost his place twice in the service. Holt, to his credit, said nothing about the scheduling conflicts of the preceding months. He did, however, begin to note in the estate diary, alongside the drainage surveys and the tenant farm reports, the schoolroom records, which Myra kept in her own clear, systematic hand, and which turned out to contain, as she had always said, everything you needed to understand about the history of a place. I stand corrected on a great many things. This is, I have found, the most useful education I have ever received. The school is still there. The vestry room is used for Sunday school, which was always its proper purpose. The sunflowers come up every summer in the narrow garden, taller each year, as though trying to make a point. I do not miss a single argument, not one. I am at last learning how to stay.